Hello friends, how are you? Hope you are doing well. So let us continue our discussion related to the GHG inventory emission calculation examples. And this is the marathon examples we are discussing till 100. So example number 83 is scope 3 employee commuting utilizing the electric vehicle for commuting purpose, and this is the total distance traveled, and this is the emission factor 0.1 kg CO2 equivalents per kilometer. Electric vehicle grade factor, we utilize the emission factor from the local utility, multiplying the total distance traveled into and the emission factor. So emissions from the use of electric vehicles for commuting, which are being determined by the source of electricity, and that is used to charge the vehicle either through the grid electricity or the renewables. Scope 3 84 example number capital goods. Again, we take example the purchased machineries, let's say 10 units we bought. This is the emission factor. This emission factor which we are basically getting from the suppliers data and emissions from manufacturing machineries. Okay, so these emissions are being generated either in the production process plus the transportation and the installation of purchased machinery, including raw material extraction and manufacturing. Again, that LCA approach we have to apply here. And 85 scope 3 capital goods, purchasing IT equipments, how many equipments units bought and what is the emission factor. Then this manufacturing data is providing the emission factor related to the IT equipment emissions. This is the calculation, and again whatever emissions from manufacturing and transportation of purchased IT equipment, including embedded in the energy basically in the production process. Example number 86 is scope 3 upstream transportation. If you see the transport of office supplies, what is the kilometer driven, then emission factor, average emission for delivery trucks, basically the transport of office supply like paper, toner from supplier to the office, typically using the delivery trucks. 87 is scope 3, again upstream transportation of the finished products or goods. 1000 kilometer like distance traveled, emission factor, transport emission factor from EPA, multiply the distance traveled into the emission factor, basically emissions coming from shipping the finished goods, how utilizing the trucks, and these trucks are going to the distribution centers or retailers. Scope 3 emissions, example use of sold products, like example taking heating products in the customer homes, 1000 units emission factor, emission from residential heating products, manufacturing data is providing the emission factors. How we do the calculation is written down here, 1000 units multiplied with the emission factor. Again, emissions which are coming from customer use of the heating products, including boilers, let's say, and space heaters which burn fuel to provide the heat in the homes actually. Then example number 89 is scope 3 upstream transportation, the fuel used for office fleet, there is the quantity being consumed, emission factor, fuel consumption emission factor for diesel, EPA, and there is the calculation done, multiplying the diesel consumed into the emission factor. So emission associated with the fuel used in the vehicle operated by the company and contributing directly to the scope 3 transportation related emissions actually. The scope 3, again one more example of end of life treatment of the sold products, but again let's say example of textile recycling, how much the quantity is 500 kg, this is the emission factor, emissions from the textile recycling process, referring the emissions from EPA, emission factor from EPA website, calculation here 500 kg multiplied with the emission factor. So this is the quantity of the recycling of the textile material. So emissions from recycling textile products at the end of their life cycle basically includes energy consumed in the collection, processing and manufacturing the materials, and of course remanufacturing basically. Okay, 91 example number is scope 3 franchise operations. Okay, franchise stores which basically use the energy, and emissions from energy consumption in the franchise stores either in the form of electricity, heating, cooling, and the factor is based on the typically energy uses in the retail stores. So let's say 100 stores. This is the emission factor per store per year. Energy uses emissions factor for retail. So we are utilizing the regional data or the local utility data. So let's see the calculation. So 100 stores multiplied with the 1500 kg, that is the emission factor. Okay, and we calculate this emissions. So basically emissions coming from franchise operations. Okay, and we consume the energy in this. Scope 3, franchise operations again, and store waste. Okay, and these are the 100 stores which are generating waste, and this is the emission factor for waste management. Okay, referring EPA for waste management emission factors. So emission generated from the waste disposal in the franchise operation, including paper, packaging, food waste related management services. Okay, this is the calculation done. What is the quantity of the waste generated from number of stores? Depends what is the emission factor. So multiply the emission factor with the number of stores will give you the results. Scope 3, franchise operations, franchise supply chain, food supplies. Basically we can take example 100 stores, and these emission factor for the food supply chain example. Supplier data is providing this, and this is the emission factor actually. Now we see the emission arising from the transportation and production of the food supplies for franchise store. This include transportation of ingredients and packaging materials, and you see the calculation from 100 stores. What is the supplies provided by the supplier, and based on the franchise supply chain, food supplies emission factor, we can calculate the total emissions. Next example number 94 is scope 3 emissions, franchise operation. Again, franchise employees are commuting, number of stores. The emission factor for commuting we are taking from EPA as a reference. So when employees are commuting at work at the franchise stores, considering typical mode of transportation such as cars and the public transport, and we do the calculation here multiplying the emission factor with the stores. 95 scope 3 example, investment related. We think about the emissions from the equity investments like $1 million, and this is the emission factor per $1 million. Investment portfolio emission factor which we get from the financial institution data, and these emissions arising from the equity investment the company holds in different businesses, other businesses, and the factor considers the emissions of the companies in which the investment is made. Another example 96 scope 3 investments. Again, this is a different kind of investment example. So emissions from debt investments, basically let's say example of the 5 million debt. This is the emission factor per million. Emissions from the debts investment, the data for emission factor is coming from the financial institution. So basically emissions from these companies in which the company has provided debt funding, and which can include indirect emissions basically, and from the business activities of those companies. So let's see how we do the calculation. This is the number of the investment $5 million multiplied with the emission factor. Next example is scope 3 emissions, investment emission from the capital investments like 3 million, let's say example, emission factor. Again same like investment in infrastructure or capital projects like including construction, energy consumption, operational emissions for project funded actually, and we do the calculation multiplying the investment with the emission factor. Scope 3 franchise operations example, and this is for advertisement is a specific category. This is the investment franchise advertising investment like $100,000, and this is the emission factor for marketing activities. What is the spend, advertising industry data, and basically the emission generated by the creation, distribution, placement of the advertising for franchise businesses. So we can see here this is the investment multiplied with the emission factors. Scope 3 investment emissions from insurance services. So insurance services related activities, let's say $1 million in premium, and this is the emission factor. Emissions which are arising from the insurance activity. So insurance industry data is providing the emission factor. Basically, we see 1 million multiplied with the emission factor, we get the emission associated with the insurance services. So emission associated with the operational activities basically of the insurance company, including underwriting, claim processing, and the environmental impact of their investments. Last example is 100. Scope 3 investment related emissions from the pension fund investments. Like this much, the investment $10 million multiplied with the emission factor. This pension data fund is providing the emission factor associated with this. Basically, these emissions are related to the holdings and investments of the company's pension fund, which may include equities, bonds, and other assets in the companies with direct operational emissions. Basically, we are talking about the operational emissions of this company emissions, and this is how we do the calculation. This is the investment, okay, and multiplied with the emission factors. Okay, that's how we get the help. So friends, we have completed 100 examples of the different emissions related scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. I hope you like them, and you can get certain advantage of this discussion, and you can generate your own GHG inventories, and you can get help out of this document. Thank you very much.